We now turn to moral education. Moral education involves various approaches. In terms of a purely academic context, this typically involves conveying information about morality, moral theories, moral principles, moral methodologies, typically without an intent to actually make people good. For example, this course is essentially academic. The goal is not to indoctrinate you into a particular moral view, but rather present various moral theories, moral approaches, and ways to argue morally. Now, not surprisingly, outside of, say, the pure context of academics, people are generally not content to simply convey information about ethics. They aim to instill values, or teach rules, or instill precepts, or impose guidelines and practices. In other words, to get people to internalize morality so they might behave properly, or at least what is defined as properly in the moral sense. Another way to approach this is training in right behavior. For example, look at Aristotle, and he focuses on training people through habituation. And so two of the main approaches to moral education are, say, purely academic education, where you learn about various moral facts, methods, etc., and of course what we might call, and Aristotle would call, a practical moral education, with the goal of not just knowing what about the good or what the good might be, but learning how to be good. Now, not surprisingly, since this is part of ethics, moral education is a matter of great controversy. Pretty much everything relating to moral education has been debated, discussed, debated again, and disputed. Very little, if anything, is agreed upon. Now, despite that problem, there are also practical matters that seem to necessitate moral education. Now, one view is this. It can be contended that to persist as a culture or a society must pass on its values, and these would presumably include moral values as well. Now, this of course can be argued against. It could be contended that a society doesn't need moral values, or that it doesn't actually need to pass on values to survive. They could survive some other way, which would seem rather odd, but that could be contended. But again, probably the most plausible argument against this is to argue that a society could survive without passing on moral values, a society devoid of morality, or a society that changes its morality and so survives with a different morality. Because after all, moral values and practices tend to change across time, and one can imagine a society continue to exist despite a radical alteration or complete change in its moral approaches. Now, of course, there are also questions about whether the specific values that a society is conveying are correct or not. Morally, of course, these values can be assessed. And of course, there's also the question of whether certain cultures, societies, and their values should survive at all. Some may be so wicked or pernicious or evil that it would be undesirable for them to continue. However, it does seem reasonable, in general, that for a society or culture to survive, moral values have to be passed on. Again, there could of course be exceptions to this. Now, a second main point is that it can be argued that a society must educate its members in acceptable behavior in order for that society to exist as an organized entity. In other words, there has to be some form of at least basic morality that limits people's behavior in order to maintain order. It seems likely that without any moral standards, a society would collapse. Similar in many ways, of course, to the state of war envisioned by Thomas Hobbes. Now, of course, it could be argued that such standards are not necessary, that you could have a stable society without any morality whatsoever. For example, they could exist solely within the confines of a legal system, as the legalists argued. That you could just have law essentially replacing morality. And perhaps there are other alternatives as well. However, it does seem at least reasonable from a practical sense to believe that societies must have some form of ethics or morality in order to maintain some semblance of order. But again, of course, that could be argued against. Now, not surprisingly, there are all kinds of issues and sub-issues relating to moral education. One main area, which I've labeled, or rather three areas, which I've labeled nature, possibility, and desirability, deals with those core concerns. The first one is human nature. And there are two key questions here. When it comes to morality, do humans have a nature? If so, what is it? Now, human nature, if it exists, is relevant both to the methods and the difficulty of moral education. How so? Well, if some people are right and humans are morally good by nature, then moral education would seem to be relatively easy and would mainly involve refinement and guidance. Because if people are naturally inclined, or rather good by nature, they would seem to just simply be good. And the challenge would just be keeping them from being corrupted. To use a crappy analogy, if people are mathematical by nature, then mathematic education would be easy. And it would mainly involve, refinement and guidance and keeping them from falling into bad habits. Now, another possibility is that humans are not good by nature, but are naturally inclined towards goodness. In this case, moral education would be, somewhat easier than if there were alternatives in place, and would mainly involve keeping people on the right track in the right direction towards goodness. Clearly, it'd be a little more challenging than if people were simply good by nature, but a natural inclination would make moral education easier than if people were not so inclined. To use again another crappy analogy, if people were naturally inclined towards, say, running, then getting them to run would be much easier than if they were not, and would mainly involve sort of getting them to do that and motivating them to keep at it. Now, another possibility is that humans are naturally neutral. That is to say, they're not inclined towards good, not inclined towards evil, that basically they're born, morally blank. To use an analogy, it's kind of like the empiricist like John Locke claimed about the mind, being born with a blank slate. And so in this case, the moral slate would not be leaning towards the good or leaning towards the bad. It'd be a morally neutral slate. There's no good, no evil there. It's just something that would have to be, written upon it by experience. Now, in that case, moral education would be more challenging than if people were inclined towards good, and definitely way more challenging than if people were good by nature, because people would not be inclined towards good, so they have to be motivated towards goodness and pushed in that direction and maintained in that particular direction. Now, but suppose humans are naturally inclined towards evil. This would make moral education more challenging, and moral education would require actively pushing people away from their inclination, away from evil, towards goodness. And this can be rather challenging. Now, another possibility is, of course, that humans are naturally evil. Then moral education would tend to be very difficult and would typically require powerful methods to force people away from their natural evil and towards goodness. Not surprisingly, some religious views take humans to be naturally evil, or naturally sinful in religious terms, and requires a great deal of effort to move them away from sin, perhaps even divine intervention. Now, of course, there's also the possibility that human nature varies from individual to individual, in which case there wouldn't be actually a human nature, but an individual nature, such that perhaps some people are naturally good, or naturally inclined towards good, or naturally evil, or naturally inclined towards evil, or naturally neutral. If that's the case, if people vary quite a bit, then moral education would of course vary considerably from person to person. This view has a certain plausibility. After all, people seem to vary quite a bit in regards to their natural inclinations towards all manner of things. Athletics, mathematics, whether they enjoy reading or not reading, their preferences in relationships, etc. So it would hardly be shocking that people would have different inclinations when it came to morality. That some people may be naturally inclined towards good or evil, or perhaps even naturally good or evil. Or perhaps there is no such thing as natural goodness or badness or even being inclined by nature. Perhaps people are basically just totally neutral and have certain inclinations that can lead to later on to being evil or good. This is, of course, greatly disputed, and different philosophers have different views. Confucius, for example, seemed to believe that people are basically good. Aristotle, on the other hand, seems to take the view that people are basically neutral, that they can go towards, virtue or towards vice. And of course, someone like Thomas Hobbes regards people as naturally selfish, and what we often regard as being kind of evil. But there's great dispute about human nature, and of course, this is a matter that would need to be addressed to properly address moral education. And not surprisingly, moral theorists who are serious about moral education do attempt to address it. Now, a second question here is the question of whether moral education is possible or not. Now, in the face of it, it seems obvious that it is. After all, past generations have passed on moral teachings to following generations, and of course, right now, I'm teaching about ethics. So at the very least, obviously conveying facts about moral theories, etc., is clearly possible. So it does seem that it is possible. Now, whether or not we're teaching the correct ethics, whether or not there is even such a thing, is a matter of dispute. And of course, people will even dispute the notion that it is possible to teach it, that is somehow, built in. However, most moral philosophers do regard it as something that can be done. Clearly, Aristotle, for example, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, etc., believe in the possibility of moral education. Now, obviously enough, just because something is possible does not mean that it is desirable. In other words, there is the question of, should morality be taught? This can actually be taken as a moral question. Is it actually ethical to teach morality? Some thinkers have opposed certain methods of moral education. For example, it could be argued that certain methods are coercive, and that children should be allowed to simply, say, clarify their values. However, in general, most thinkers regard moral education as desirable. Naturally, they regard their particular, moral theory as what is desirable to teach people, but in general, if you were to ask them, is moral education in general desirable, they typically would say yes. And of course, most people regard it as desirable on purely practical grounds, namely that, from a purely practical standpoint, we got to teach the kids something to keep them from doing horrible stuff. And moral education seems to be one way to try to reduce the horribleness in society. But of course, again, it could be argued that it's undesirable. And of course, it is perfectly reasonable to argue that certain methods would be undesirable, and of course that certain moral approaches would be undesirable. Now, a second main area involves the questions who, why, and what. Now, in regards to the matter of purpose, the question is, what is the purpose of moral education? And there are various answers to this question. For example, some claim that it has a very practical aim of making people good. Others contend it should aim at theoretical knowledge to teach people about various moral views, such as in the context of this academic class, where the objective is not to indoctrinate you in a particular moral dogma, but provide you with information about how to reason morally using various methods, knowledge about various theories, etc. There's also the view that moral education should aim at helping students clarify their values. Values clarification used to be all the rage some years ago. Seems to have quieted down a bit, though, but I'm sure it's still being pushed in various places. Another option is perhaps moral education should provide the student with various alternatives, kind of a smorgasbord, which allows them to choose, while also encouraging tolerance. And there are various approaches to the purpose. And as you might imagine, people disagree about this quite a bit. Now there's also the question of the moral educators. That is, who should be the moral educator? Now, another way to look at this is in terms of blame. Namely, when people go bad or do bad things, who is to blame? And this is especially raised in the case of kids. When kids do something bad, there's always the question of, who failed them? Who failed to educate them? And of course, it also applies to adults. When adults do bad things, people do often, raise the question of why? Why did they do this? Who failed them? Was it, did the media lead them astray, their parents, etc.? So it involves a question of who is responsible for educating, which also involves who takes the blame if the people educated turn out to be bad. Now, presumably, we should choose as educators the people best able to educate others in morality. These are the people that would then be accountable for failures in moral education. Now, there are very standard answers. Family is put forth as the moral educator, and also typically, held accountable when people go bad. Religious institutions are put forth as moral educators. They teach people various values, and again, they're sometimes blamed when members of their particular, sects or faiths go bad. Educational institutions like schools also involved, and again, when people go bad, especially kids, the schools are often blamed as well. And of course, the state, sort of generically as moral educator. And of course, people also put forth notions of other individuals that aren't family, or religious leaders, or actual educators, people who are role models, athletes, celebrities, musicians. And of course, people often point to, say, games and movies as moral or typically immoral educators that lead people to badness. And so there is the question as to who should be the educator, and thus who should take the blame. Not surprisingly, various theorists give different answers. Aristotle, for example, contends at length and presents several arguments as to why the state should be the moral educator. And there are other arguments for other educators as well. Now, if we were able to sort out what's the purpose of moral education and who should do it, there's also the question of what we should be teaching. Now, one possibility is to focus on one morality, one single view. One good argument for this is based on the fact that it would be problematic to teach people different moralities, at least if the goal is to make people good. If the goal is to simply inform people about moralities, then a variety would, of course, be desirable. Now, getting back to the point about one morality, if people are given different moralities, they will probably notice that these will tend to be inconsistent, perhaps even contradictory. And teaching different moralities to a student in terms of trying to get them to be good could be rather confusing. To use, an analogy, imagine someone trying to teach, say, math, and teaching all kinds of different views about math, and not saying which one was correct. That would tend to confuse the students. And so there is an advantage to having one morality being taught, because, again, the students have one thing to focus on, there's one right answer being presented, and it avoids confusion. Of course, there's also a case that can be made for teaching several or a variety of moralities. Why? Well, one reason is that it's claimed that exposure to different moral views can lead to tolerance. People are able to see different moralities, and rather than just being, sort of narrowly educated in the alleged one true view, they get a diversity that can enable them to have an understanding, appreciation of other views, and although they might, pick a particular morality and stick to it, their understanding of other moralities can help them become more tolerant. Now, it's also a good reason to avoid teaching just one morality, because it's pretty unlikely that one morality has gotten everything right. And there's also some moral concerns about imposing one morality. Namely, it seems rather authoritarian to simply just impose on people the alleged one true view. And interestingly enough, simply forcing people to conform to one morality through the process of moral education could be seen as violating their rights. And so a good case can be made for, if the goal is to, again, make people good, to focus on one morality, one voice, no distractions. However, a reasonable case can be made for exposing people, even in the process of practical moral education, to several moralities, to enable them to see alternatives and perhaps learn tolerance, or perhaps learn to understand other views. Now, suppose we've managed to decide what we're trying to do, who's going to teach it, whether to teach one or several moralities. Then we have to decide on content, namely, what do we put in there? What sort of things do we teach? And this, of course, is a matter of considerable dispute, because this would be the actual moral theory being presented. And as might be imagined, all moral theorists tend to disagree with each other in their moral views, and then when you bring in, people who aren't professional academics, they of course disagree quite a bit. If you take, people who are basing their morality on their religion, well, pretty much people with different religions or different interpretations will disagree considerably. And then you bring in other things, political morality, etc., and you have a great deal of dispute. So there's a very practical problem if we're trying to educate people morally. What do we put in the content? And that is, as you might imagine, a very difficult thing to settle. Now, suppose we're able to settle that. Who's going to teach it? What are they going to teach? Then there's a question of how it's going to be done. How should morality be taught? Now, this is a practical matter in many ways. One is, of course, just a practical matter of education. What are the most effective means of conveying values, facts, information, methods to people? And that's essentially a matter for education. There's also, of course, the question of what are the best methods specific to morality? What works best if you're trying to make people good, in making them good? Now, if we're just attempting to teach, say, ethics as an academic subject, like we might teach history or biology or physics, then we could rely on whatever the most effective method of teaching in general would be, because the goal would be to convey information and skills. But what if we're trying to make people good? Well, that changes things, because there's most likely a difference between the methods used to, say, convey methodologies, skills, facts, and information, and the methodology that must be used to actually make someone good, whatever that might mean. Now, some people favor the method of talking, what's called discourse, where you have moral lectures, moral discussions, sermons, public service announcements, those sorts of things. Like the classic, just say no to drugs. Now, as we'll see, thinkers like Aristotle think that discourse, merely talking at people, won't work. But as you might imagine, this method is favored quite a bit. People often give sermons, they give lectures, people are told what to do and not to do. And so there is the question of whether simply talking about it is effective. Another option is the classic method of models, presenting role models to people and having them emulate them. For example, I recall back to my ancient days in elementary school, we were taught about founding fathers, like how Washington never told a lie, how Lincoln freed people, and how Jefferson did all this great stuff, and we were taught about other historical figures, and we were presented them as role models to be like them. And of course, today, people turn to athletes often as role models, which leads to some interesting, problems. One athlete famously said that he wasn't a role model, but of course, there is the question of whether a person gets to choose to be a role model or not. Namely, that people can seek to emulate them, whether or not they put themselves forth as a role model or are simply just, say, trying to play basketball. And there are interesting questions there about responsibility. If someone is in, the public eye as an athlete or an actor, do they have a special obligation to serve as a role model? Now, on one hand, of course, it could be argued that no. If you have someone, if their job is to take that basketball and put it through that hoop, then that's their job. Their job description doesn't include teaching people morality by serving as a role model. But of course, it could be argued that they do have a responsibility. After all, they do have an influence on others. And so if they accept, say, the pay, the endorsements, and so forth of being a associated with being a pro athlete, along with that comes responsibility. So if they're willing to use their reputation to sell, sneakers or sports beverages, then they should also take responsibility for that because the public gives them that fame, and that comes with responsibility, could be argued. And so if they're willing to accept all the benefits of celebrity status and their influence over people to get them to buy, shoes and sports beverages and so forth, then it would seem to come with responsibility to serve as a good role model to others. And of course, it could be argued that they have no such obligation. Just because people regard them as celebrities and would be willing to foolishly buy a sports beverage just because they said so, or buy expensive, shoes because they said so, that's they're failing. That the celebrity has no responsibility to serve as a model whatsoever. And so the matter of models can be an interesting point of moral discussion. Now there's also the classic method of habituation, which involves training people by repeated activity. This is the method favored by Aristotle, and it's kind of like, training in anything. So, for example, if someone wants to get good at the martial arts or good at running, basically you do it by repetition. You just, practice a block over and over and over again. You run, practice, running over and over again. Similarly for other skills. And that is a certain plausibility, as we'll see when we talk about Aristotle discussing habit and virtue. But now we end the general introduction to moral education